Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first art lecture of the semester. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about Chapter 25, particularly focusing on the early 20th century art movements. But to begin any kind of conversation about early 20th century art, it makes sense for us to stop and dwell a little bit on Cubism, which a lot of you probably already know a few things about. Developed in Paris, a lot of people really put it reaching its height in the years leading up to World War One. One of the works that establishes or sparks or is a kind of catalyst for Cubism would be Pablo Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein, you'll remember, one of the well-known modernist poets. So any kind of consideration of Picasso could be pretty usefully put into dialogue with the poetry that we've seen with Stein, especially this emphasis on fragmentation and on making art very tactile, taking abstract concepts and making them concrete. So for Stein, that was taking poetry, taking words, and making them objects that could almost be touched or sensed. And for Picasso, it was taking more classical, Enlightenment-based styles of painting, which were based on this kind of sense of mimesis, sense of replicating or copying reality as it was, or Impressionism with its kind of fuzzy, subjective perspective, and bringing it back where the art object, too, becomes this very tactile, sensory object for our contemplation. So you take the portrait that Picasso makes of Gertrude Stein from 1906, and when you look at this portrait, you can see that it has a very strange composition. If space in painting previously had really been focused on this natural sense of depth with the vanishing point perspective and all of these things from classical painting, here we have a new orientation in space. We have organic depth, where the face becomes almost like a sculpture. It becomes like it was chiseled out of stone. And that's something very three-dimensional, something very natural. And on the other hand, there's something very flattened about Picasso's portrait. It's very jagged and very inorganic. Shapes are doing things that they don't do in the natural world. So I think that kind of tension is really something that Cubism is going to play with to some extent. For other examples of this, we could turn to the Women of Avignon in 1907. That's in your textbook on page 837. Whenever we do these lectures, it might be helpful for you to have your textbook with you so that you can open to specific images that we're going to discuss. After all, your art reflections are going to have to really focus on a painting or a sculpture and talk about it at some length. So if you have your book with you, it's page 837, The Women of Avignon. Here I think we see this rejection of classical ideals. If classical ideals in painting in the West have been about depth, about perspective, about this vanishing point, here instead we remove all of those kinds of expectations in favor of what has been called primitivism. You can certainly see when you look at the painting that there are African and Egyptian figures prominently featured based on these kinds of traditional masks and sculptures and these sorts of things. Nothing in this painting is really symmetrical. Everything seems to be a little bit off kilter. Nothing is what we would call traditionally beautiful. It is this juxtaposition between organic, three-dimensional, heavy space where the women seem to look as though they were chiseled from stone, at odds with this flattening too, where there are parts of the painting that seem to be completely unnatural, completely artificial. Um, this kind of fragmentation is part of the tension. Again, you could make interesting connections, and many people have, to modernist poetry that we've talked about. What I have used the phrase back to the future, going back to go forward. So there are these two things happening in this painting. We're going dramatically back in time to ancient cultures in Africa and Egypt in order to break free and move forward from what Picasso thought was the kind of stagnation of Enlightenment style painting that was too grounded in these rules and regulations. So to make something radically new, like Cubism, you both had to go far into the past in order to propel yourself dramatically into the future, which has this kind of tug of war effect, or this kind of shattering in half effect of being pulled in both directions. So that sense of fragmentation and tension is really present in the Women of Avignon. Identity itself, in the years leading up to following this kind of heavy industrialism, leading up to the tragedy and barbarity of World War I, modern identity becomes this kind of inorganic thing that is lacking cohesion. It doesn't really make sense anymore. What does it mean to be human in such a rapidly changing world? That's something that Picasso is trying to consider at length here. So, another thing to consider with this painting is it's very difficult to get one singular perspective on the painting. If you step back from it a little bit, you can see how in traditional Western Enlightenment style painting, there was this organic wholeness to the image, that everything could be kind of consumed or taken in with one, looking from one perspective, and you could get this sense of totality or wholeness. Cubism really distorts that. Cubism forces the spectator, the person looking at the painting, to adopt several perspectives all at once. There is no way to fully encapsulate the subject matter of the Women of Avignon with simply one view. It forces your eye to look from multiple angles and to look at from multiple vantage points, which completely undoes this sense of singular perspective. And that's really important because identity is largely based, or identity at that time leading up to the early 20th century had been based on this illusion of a singular identity. I am me, and I have this singular perspective on the world, and everything is very cohesive. Progress, beauty, truth, all of these things are very one-dimensional, and I have a full grasp of them. And here you have a painting that completely undoes those expectations and forces us to realize that we are much more broken into pieces than we would originally realize. You can look also at one of Picasso's collaborators, Georges Braque, who equally wants to explore geometric space, who wants to recognize that the truth is actually not in the kind of soft and blurry lines of Impressionism, but can actually be found in the hard, jagged, well-defined lines of Cubism. There is something here that isn't subjective. There's something, for Georges Braque and especially, there's something about stone that makes it universal, that makes the language of modernism both terribly new, but also terribly familiar. It goes back to myth and to ancient cultures that seem to be cyclically, think of the poetry of Yeats again, cyclically with us. These stories, these ideas, these icons that keep coming back in human history. So again, something terribly new and something terribly old in the same image. We could gesture also here, Cubists were very interested in collage, and there are some images in this chapter that you will have looked at. collage is really interesting because it is that kind of make it new ethos of early 20th century art. Take these older things that are outdated, that no longer speak to modern Western sensibilities, and deconstruct them, break them into pieces, and then put them back together in some new order. It is both critical of this early 20th century mode of living, right? Because it's jarring, it's unsettling, it makes us feel fragmented and lost and isolated and broken apart. And those things can be considered a critique of the industrial society and what it has wrought. But on the other hand, you can also look at this and see that it is a positive, that there has been, here there have been seeds of great change, that it was a necessary evolution to take these old ideas, rethink them, reimagine them, and put something new, recycle them into something more valuable that speaks to us as people. And we still do this today. I mean, it's one of the tenets of capitalism. It's one of the tenets, certainly, for in a more kind of common sense. We can talk about social media and this kind of, taking older images and doing new things with them. It's both negative and, in some senses, liberating. In some senses, it could be considered positive. For other examples of Cubism, you might look at Guernica, 1937, portraying the Spanish Civil War, which we'll read and talk more about. This is a very, very famous image. I think you could certainly talk about the shapes, as we have with other examples. The multiple perspectives. The painting doesn't allow one total viewing. You have to kind of it forces us to adopt multiple vantage points. But I would want to focus here too on color, which is something that synthetic cubism is really interested in as opposed to analytic cubism. Analytic cubism, just to kind of boil it down, more interested in the idea of shapes. Synthetic cubism, more interested in the idea of color. I'm not saying that this is a synthetic cubist work, because here we still have this focus on shapes, but we do have the importance of color here. The coloration of this image is meant to mimic the color of newspapers. So you have this deathly pale, kind of grim vision maybe of death. But on the other hand, you have, it seems to be the presentation of truly horrific images that the world by 1937 has seen time and time and time again. These images of brutality, war, horror, deprivation. And I think part of what he's trying to do here is show the separation between journalistic accounts of these atrocities and the atrocities themselves. And so an image that should be vibrant and appealing to us through this explosive use of color restrains itself to show this detachment between what we're reading in the newspaper, which makes us feel alienated and detached, from the horrors that are actually going on. And that dualism is captured nicely in the painting. There are emblems here to kind of go with this idea of tension a little bit further. There are emblems in the painting that are hopeless, like the horse being killed, but there are also a lot of emblems that are hopeful. The broken sword, you can find the flower, the lamp of liberty. These are all symbols that are kind of scattered throughout the image. So it's this chaotic jumble of hopefulness and hopelessness, past, present, color and atrocity versus detachment and clinical treatment of these subjects. Cubism does an excellent job of leaving us with this sense of either or, both and, this dualism or tension in the modern condition. So we should turn our attention a little bit now to futurism. Whereas Cubism is really born in Paris, and bred in French soil, Futurism finds its roots in Italy. the main, I guess, thesis of futurism is that the mechanical age, the machine age, is a very dynamic one, in which we're surrounded every day by creative energy, dynamic machines that can do amazing things, and are full of this stored up energy that really makes our older sensibilities seem antiquated and irrelevant. Don't have this kind of nostalgia for older art forms. It's when you go to the museum and you feel this reverence for these, vanishing point perspective, Enlightenment style paintings, or even the kind of quaint impressionism of, ponds and sunsets and these kinds of things. Stop that kind of reverence and turn your attention to the glory for futurism of the machine age. You can look at the unique forms of continuity in space from 1913, Baccioni's sculpture, in which it is really trying to give up recreating life or organic forms and completely submit yourself to the mechanical and robotic movements of the machine age. You could also see Laguerre's painting of the city, in which you have this depiction of the city as being cold, mechanical, industrial. The image is clearly anonymous. There are no subjects on which we should be focusing our attention, no humans. It is extremely energetic, but we don't see a lot of human life. So there's this kind of supplanting of what it means to be human with what it means to be machine. And the futurism then really nicely captures the sensibility of urban life, in which things are fragmented, things are detached, and things are always in motion. And that kind of art was clearly not even possible, even as early as, or as recently at that point, as the late 19th century. By the 19 teens and 1920s, there is an explosion of energy in the machine world. And we are suddenly surrounded in this frenzy of mechanical activity. I want to finish by talking a little bit, I want to recapture some of these themes by talking about architecture. You're all familiar probably with Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous architect from Chicago. If the early 20th century was, then in late 19th century, was an age of skyscrapers. Louis Sullivan's is the famous architect who designed the original skyscrapers. Frank Lloyd Wright comes along to basically counter that kind of gigantic sensibility, the sense of modern life being larger than anything, and turns to what is called a prairie style, in which if a skyscraper is this super unnatural, inorganic column just kind of placed in the middle of nature, Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to explore how homes and architecture could actually be part of the environment, that it's not imposed upon the environment, but one and the same. In that, he was pretty heavily indebted to Japanese architects who for centuries had really been trying to connect the home and the building with its natural surroundings. You can look at the Roby House in 1909 in Chicago. That's on page 855, where you have the importance of a kind of central hearth that then radiates in these concentric circles around it. As like a prairie, everything is flattened, the horizons are all visible, and everything is very open. So it's like being out on the prairie, but you're at home. You could also look at Falling Water from 1936. That's on page 856 in your textbook, which is an even clearer example of how Frank Lloyd Wright saw the home being blending with a lot of synthesis into the surrounding area. Here you have waterfalls and rock ledges that are quite naturally blended together, so as though the home just kind of grew out of its natural surroundings. So on that front, we have this going back to these ancient styles, going back to this idea of nature and man being one. There's almost this kind of Edenic quality to Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie School. On the other hand, you have the international style, which is happening in Europe. The international style can be talked about by looking at the Schroeder House, which is in the Netherlands, and that was built in the 1920s. I think the Schroeder House is more clearly deriving from Cubism. It's less about this organic connection to surroundings and much more about tension and opposition. It's impossible in the house and looking at the house to get a singular perspective, this idea of the totality, this illusion of wholeness. Instead, you have to constantly shift your view. There are these simultaneous perspectives, which remind us of Picasso paintings. And in the international style, you have a radical movement into the future in which the singular identity of Western life is blown apart and kind of put back together in all kinds of new, interesting, exciting, but alienating and fragmentary ways. So I guess in closing here, we could look at everything that we just discussed. We can go from Cubism to Frank Lloyd Wright to the Schroeder House and beyond. We can look at all of these early 20th century forms and see again the tension, the driving impulses of modernism in literature and art. On one hand, to capture the energy pulsating in industrialism, in modern growth, in modern development, in machinery. Capture that, harness it, because there's something thrilling and exciting about being part of the engine of growth, part of that machine that is driving us into the future quickly, rapidly, rather dramatically. For some people, it's a terrifying disorientation. And at the same time, not separate from, but at the same time, retreating rapidly into the past, trying to avoid these alienated, fragmentary things and go back into a time when things were primitive and universal, the ancient sculptures, the primitive forms, the organic things that we are trampling on and destroying in our march towards more industrial progress. We want to cherish these things and cling to them and find wholeness and meaning in them at the same time as we want to harness this machine that is breaking things apart and making new life. Tensions pulling the artistic world apart. And I think that kind of duality is a really interesting one and makes discussing early 20th century art a very fruitful exercise. So your task for the end of this week is to choose a couple of art forms. Could be sculpture, could be architecture, could be painting. Choose a couple of examples and talk about it in your art reflection. Again, try to focus really specifically on the details. Look at the paintings, look at the houses, look at the sculptures, and think about how they were composed. Think about the formal qualities of these things. So don't just make connections to society and to history, but also dwell a little bit on the piece of art and consider how it was put together. And I will look forward to hearing what you have to say. All right, thanks everybody.